Today we are going to talk about Islam, the meaning of the word Islam. Now, many people, and some scholars included, have stated that the word Islam linguistically comes from the Arabic root salama, which means peace. The word Islam means submission. This is its linguistic meaning, submission. In the context of the religion, it means submission to the will of God. Now, of course, when we say the word submission, for most people, it has a type of negative connotation. It produces in our minds and in our hearts a type of negative idea. And that's because we are constantly indoctrinated with the idea of freedom, especially living in the West, the idea that we are a free society. One of the statements that is very common you hear people saying in the West is, this is a free country, this is a free society. And often we hear politicians in the West talking about how we are free nations and how we want to spread freedom like the freedom that we have across the world. Of course, in reality, the idea that we are free is really propaganda. What I would like us all to think about today is this concept of submission and freedom. And I would really like us to question how free we really are. Let's think about ourselves, let's think about our lives. All of us, we live in societies and in communities. All of us, human beings, have some concept, some idea of what we think is right and what we think is wrong, what we think is good, what we think is evil, what we think is appropriate behavior or inappropriate behavior, what we often call good manners and bad manners. So all of us have some idea, and very often we find that in one country something may be considered to be good manners, and in another country that same thing may be considered to be bad manners. For example, in some countries, if you have a nice meal and then you let out wind through your mouth, you burp as we call it, that's considered very disgusting and a revolting thing to do. But in other countries considered an act of appreciation that you've enjoyed the meal. It just gives you an example of how in two different cultures exactly the same thing can be considered to be in one culture good manners, in another culture bad manners. But my point is this, is that all of us have a viewpoint, a way through which and by which we look at the world around us and we understand and we make judgments about the people around us and about the world around us. No one is free from that. And in a very real sense, we are submitting to those ideas. Let's just think for a few minutes. Where do we get those ideas from? Who told us that this is right and this is wrong, that this is good and this is evil? Who told us that these are good manners and bad manners? Where did you get that information from? Think about it for a few minutes. Maybe some of you will be saying, our parents, that's where we got this knowledge from. Others will be saying, our teachers at school. Some will be saying, our friends. Some will be saying, our society, our religion, our government, the laws of our country. One of the strongest and the most powerful influences in the way that we think and the way that we look at the world is the media, especially the television, the films that we watch, the music that we listen to, the radio programs that we tune into. They have a very powerful effect in shaping the way that we look at the world. And in a very real sense, we are submitting to those ideas. We are submitting to those concepts. I'm sure many of us have been to school. And at school, I'm sure also many of us had to wear a school uniform. And I'm also pretty sure that a lot of us didn't really like wearing that school uniform. Well, if we live in free countries and it's a free society, why do you have to wear a uniform that you don't like? Why do you have to dress in clothes that you don't want to? What does it mean then, I live in a free society? What we realize is that we are not really free at all. All of us have to follow laws. And there are many laws that we find regulate our lives in so many different ways. And in a very real sense, we submit to those laws. What does submission mean? Think about the word submission. What does it mean? When you submit, what are you doing? You are giving in. You are surrendering. In other words, when you submit, you do something that maybe you don't necessarily want to do, but you do it because you are told to, or because you know that it's good for you, or that you know that if you do this other thing, it's bad for you. Often we submit to an authority that we believe and that we understand is more intelligent and more well-informed than us. That's why we go to a doctor. If the doctor says to us, well, you know, you've got this problem and you're going to need an operation, and if you don't have an operation in the next 2 days, you'll die. Most of us don't think about studying the disease, finding out are there other cures, so on and so forth. We don't have the energy, we don't have the time, we don't have the knowledge foundations in order to do that. In other words, we trust the doctor and we do what the doctor says, even though sometimes the operation may be threatening our life, but we'll take that advice from the doctor. In that sense, in that very real sense, we are submitting. So our life is in fact full of submission. We submit to many different things. We submit to many different people in our lives. The idea that we are free is really a type of propaganda. No human being is free. Everybody submits to someone or something. The question is, who do you submit to? What do you submit to? This is the real question. I'd like you to think about a scenario. It may seem these days a very strange scenario, but believe me, there was a time not very long ago when this scenario that I'd like you to imagine was very common. In fact, for most of human history, it was a norm that people would be sold into and subjected to slavery. Slavery in the sense where one human being was literally the owner of another human being. You could go to a marketplace in many different places in the world and you could buy a slave, like you could buy some clothes, like you could buy some food. You could go to the marketplace and you could buy a slave. Now I want you to imagine, try and imagine it, and try and visualize it. Try and imagine yourself there at the slave market. But what I want you to really try and imagine is that you are one of the slaves. You are one of those people, those unfortunate people, that is going to be sold as a slave. Think about that. Imagine you're standing there in the marketplace. Maybe you're chained up and people are looking at you. Someone out there is going to be thinking of buying you, of purchasing you, and then you will belong to that person, and that person will be able to do with you whatever they like. What sort of master would you like to have? What sort of master would you like to be a slave to? And then think about something else. I'm sure that deep in your heart you'll be hoping at this stage, you'll be praying that there's another type of master that you don't get. A cruel master, an unkind master, a hard master. Why don't we imagine something even worse than that? Imagine you're not bought by one master, but imagine you're bought by 5 or 6. In other words, 5 or 6 people get together and they say, well, we can't afford a slave by ourselves, but if we each put in some money, then together we can buy a slave. So imagine now, you are one human being owned by 5 or 6 different people. Imagine that. How would your life be? How do you think your life is going to be? Master A, master number 1 will say to you, do this. Master B will say, do that. Master C will say, do that. Master D will say, do this. Master E will say that. Every single master is telling you to do a different thing. How is your life going to be? Your life will be terrible. Your life will be a very distressing life, a very uncomfortable life. Yet I think that I have already described the life of most of you right now. Think about it. Your parents want you to do this thing. Your friends want you to do something else. Your wife, your husband, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, they want you to do something different. Your culture and your tradition tells you you should do something else. And you yourself, you don't feel like doing any of those things. You feel like doing something altogether different. That's exactly the situation. We are a slave to many masters. Which one shall we please? Who shall we obey? Each one is calling us in a different direction. What a terrible, miserable, unhappy life most of you are leading. Let's go back to Islam. Let's really now understand what Islam is all about. Islam is about being a slave to one master, submitting only to one criterion, to one idea and one concept of what is right and wrong and good and evil, what we should do and what we shouldn't do, what is appropriate behavior and what is inappropriate behavior. One master, one guidance, one way. So who is better? The one who submits to one master, who is merciful and kind and forgiving and knows what is good for us and would only guide us to what is good for us. This is the example of the one who submits to Allah, the all-wise, all-knowing, all-hearing, all-seeing, merciful, compassionate creator of the heavens and the earth, who has revealed his guidance in the Quran, and who sent his messenger Muhammad, may God's peace and blessings be upon him, to be a living example of how to follow that guidance from God. And that is why the Prophet Muhammad said that he was happy, he was proud to be called a slave of Allah. Because, believe me, all of us are slaves to someone or to something. It's just a question who you choose and what you choose to be a slave and a servant to. Therefore, Islam means submission to Allah, to be a servant to Allah, to be the slave of Allah.